Ottawa is easing rules at its border for fully vaccinated Canadian travelers starting on July 5th, and that includes dropping the mandatory hotel quarantine. Federal ministers made the announcement this morning.
The government has implemented strong measures to secure our borders and to keep Canadians safe. These measures have proven to be effective, but of course they were never intended to be permanent, and as Minister Hajdu has indicated, phase one of the approach that we are taking to ease border measures will begin on July 5th with reduced public health measures for fully vaccinated travelers with a right of entry and foreign nationals who are currently eligible to enter Canada. It is the traveler's responsibility to plan ahead, to understand their obligations, and to ensure that they are eligible. They should do this before heading to the border.
Now we have lots of coverage and analysis on this. The CBC's Janice McGregor is in Ottawa and Farah Morelli in Washington and have been poring over the federal briefing. As Janice explains, the new rules for fully vaccinated travelers fall short of what many were hoping for.
It is really limited. We do have a date now, which was a key thing we were waiting for the point after which, if you are a Canadian citizen or permanent resident, you are now no longer required to go to those quarantine hotels, July 5th. So for anyone who needs to kind of plan accordingly, that will be significant. But remember, this is not for people who are not Canadian citizens or permanent residents. This does not help them escape quarantine hotels. This is not the end of quarantine hotels. And it is only for people who are fully vaccinated with the full kind of regimen required for a vaccine. So that's both doses. If it's a 2-dose vaccine, obviously, if you got the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, 1 dose is sufficient. A number of questions, answers emerging to things we had been wondering about. First, let's talk about the children. We now know that if it is a family returning and the adults in that family, or people over 12, adolescents too, who are currently eligible to receive a vaccine, if they are fully vaccinated, but there are other children in the family under 12, they don't have to go to a quarantine hotel. They can stay in their family units and return and isolate with their families. But you heard some reporters honing in on how this works, where you're saying, well, the parents aren't under quarantine, but the kids are, and whether that kind of proposal has integrity. You heard them kind of wrestling with the specifics of that. The other big change here is how they're doing it. They're using app technology. You heard some questions about that. This is not optional. You can't go with paperwork anymore. You will be fined. It's mandatory. If you don't have a smart phone to use their app, you have to find another way to enter your information online. They say that this has been in operation for a couple of months now, and they're confident that this will work in terms of certifying people's vaccination and test results. But I have to say, if you know people who have had to make this trip, the app is not foolproof. It has not always been working well for people. So I think some questions remain about their strategy there. Finally, I'll just outline the other significant bit of news in this, which is a bit of immigration news. For some 23,000 people who have been newly approved as permanent residents of this country, but that approval came after a key date, March 18th, 2020. And some of those people, not necessarily if they were already in Canada or in the US, that's been fine. But if that happened abroad, they have struggled, not been able to actually come and start their lives in Canada. Now, with this new change, they will be able to come to Canada if they meet the other criteria. So that is going to be a big deal, both from a family reunification point of view. I suspect that helps some people, but it's also important to some businesses that may have been trying to bring key employees here, might have already had all that paperwork approved to make them permanent residents, help them make that real move, but then have been stuck since all this pandemic stuff began.
Yeah, since March 2020. So there's that. Janice, I'm going to come back to you in just a second. Let's bring in Farah here. One of the things that, of course, that's been reported is that the border to non-essential travel will remain closed at this point until July 21st. You've been reporting on pressure from U.S. border states, politicians, business groups to get that border fully open. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so for quite some time now, there have been growing calls from not just businesses here in the United States, but from lawmakers too, for the Canada-U.S. border to open fully and immediately. Those calls have been coming from both Democrats and Republicans here in the United States, particularly in the border states. And their argument is that the rules as they stand now, they say, defy logic. If you look at a state like New York, which is the #1 source of travelers coming into Canada, 62% of adults are fully vaccinated. So they say this argument of, health and safety issues doesn't really hold water. We know that there have been statements from certain members of Congress that the rules in Canada have lacked transparency. There hasn't been discussion. Certain Republican lawmakers have really pushed President Joe Biden on why he didn't pressure Justin Trudeau on this issue when they met at the G7 recently. So certainly a lot of, really the rules today don't go as far as what many Americans want. But I will speak as well about the perspective of Canadians in the U.S., particularly snowbirds. This is welcome news for many of them who'd been aggressively pushing for the rules to change for some time. Many of them have been fully vaccinated for a while. They've just been kind of sitting and waiting for the rules to change. They had been pushing back against quarantine hotels. That's something that is now will be removed, provided they meet those certain requirements, which Janice just explained.
Yeah, and Janice, one of the things that the ministers were being pressed on is the metrics for the next phase of reopening. It took a lot of pushing to finally hear potential number in there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, because I don't think we're clear at all on those metrics. I don't think they want to be pinned down on those metrics. One of the issues here is that the federal model on which they kind of lay down some markers previously didn't include the Delta variant. And so they are now, I think, feeling pretty cautious about saying how many people need to be vaccinated before we can do X and Y, because they're not quite sure how that variant is going to behave in different places. And frankly, they feel they can't afford to be caught out and having to reimpose lockdowns. And they have certain provinces, especially Ontario, very anxious about moving too quickly with border opening, because in the minds of the Ontario government, remember, international travel is a big driver of the pandemic period. So they have some political issues to manage. And I think that kind of speaks to why they don't want to be nailed down here. You heard them talking about how they have to work these metrics out with the provinces, and there's a lot of things they're discussing. But, from people abroad looking from the outside, like we found out today, for example, that the ban on direct flights from India and Pakistan is going to continue for another month. Air Canada let the cat out of the bag even before the ministers spoke by not resuming its direct flights until the end of July. A lot of people feeling quite anxious about this at this time, when they're still not really sure kind of how these variants are moving around. I think, the real takeaway, though, is it's really clear from these ministers that they don't really have a big plan to lay out here. These have been some pretty incremental things. In the case of the flight ban, the direct flight ban for India and Pakistan, they've just chosen to kick the can. There was not the clear articulation that businesses and other people were looking for of a step-by-step reopening here. The ministers just kind of still push back on that.
The CBC's Janice McGregor in Ottawa and Farah Morali in Washington.